Hey, hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today, topic of discussion, and it's been a while since I've been on here, but I got a lot of positive feedback from the Speaker's Corner video and Decas in general, so I thought today I would talk about some Deutsche Grammophon records. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that is I started my classical journey through Deutsche Grammophon records, and I'm sure a lot of other people have as well. And you quickly become familiar with the label. It has a connotation among people who don't listen to classical as much as the kind of audiophile classical record label. But today I thought I would talk about some of the goods and the bad aspects of it, as well as kind of go through my journey of collecting Deutsche Grammophones and a lot of things I learned about the label, because it's very often talked about alongside Decca and living stereos. So I initially started, this is really the first classical thing that I bought, which was Beethoven's 9 Symphonies by Karajan. This is a digital record. I think it sounds decent, but what I noticed is that it, on a lower grade system, it will sound better. I should also note this is the 63 cycle that he did. It sounds very good on a lower end system because the bass really punches through, but it becomes very bass heavy as you upgrade your system more and more. And like usual, I will post the description of the system that I have in the description below, just in case you want to see how my opinions fare. Maybe if you have a similar system, you'll have similar ideas about some of these records. So generally, this is a good place maybe to get started. It's not that expensive. But I know Beethoven is very popular, especially Karajan. So, after this point, I kind of got into more of the all analog instead of digital records. And just for Beethoven symphonies, I would personally recommend getting the 77 cycle, which is this box set here. This was gifted to me by a friend of mine. It's actually signed by Karajan, so I thought that was super cool. It sounds better. It sounds really good in general, but it's not as good as those Decas and living stereos, and so that's what I wanted to get into. Generally, the sound of Deutsche Grammophones overall, they don't have as much of a dynamic range. They're not as bass rich. The tone of the strings is not as refined, I would say. And I'll get into more what I mean when I go through some of the records, but for Deutsche Grammophon, I thought I would say that the best sounding pressings of these, just like the Decas and the living stereos, is those early stereo recordings, so from the late 50s and early 60s. And generally, and I'm sure a lot of people know this as well, but what you want to look for is what are known as tulip labels. And basically that's just your Deutsche Grammophon typical label, except it has this embroidered kind of edge around the whole record. So this one is just like La Traviata, and this is a German first pressing of this from whenever, 1961 or something, I'm not 100% sure. But these are the ones from the tube amplifier era, and they just have a nice natural sound. They have a nice sound stage. There's different variants of the tulip label, but generally they sound pretty similar. And the change afterwards, later into the 70s, and I believe also the late 60s, is when they got rid of this tulip label. So generally what you want to look for is these tulip labels. And now, first good about these records, these tulips are pretty easy to find. I find them all the time, and they're generally very cheap, and they're in great condition. Finding an original wideband Decca or a Shaded Dog living stereo originals, you can find them, but they're going to be in really bad condition most of the time. So generally when it comes to Decca, as I mentioned in a previous video, I stick to the narrow bands, the later 70s era, and later 60s. But for Deutsche Grammophon, you don't have to skimp on that. You don't have to go for the second best. Generally, these tulips are very easy to find. So if you're a collector of late 50s, early 60s classical, these tulips would be the way to go for sure. Again, they don't sound as good as the wide bands and as the living stereos, but the equivalent exchange of that is that they're cheap and they're generally in very good condition. That, I think, is the main thing that Deutsche Grammophones have going for them. They're usually in very, very good condition. Living stereos are the complete opposite. I usually find them in horrible condition, and even if they look clean, the vinyl noise is just outright unlistenable, especially when you're listening to classical. So generally they're really easy to find. And I mean, one thing that I thought was just cool to just show that is, this is a Brahms box set from the 70s, Karajan recording it along with the Tragic Overture on it, so Brahms's 4 symphonies. I got this for $10 and it was sealed. So this was first opened by me. The first time this has been listened to in 45, 50 years. And it was $10. And it doesn't sound fantastic, but it still sounds great and it's still listenable because it's so clean. And it sounds better than a lot of the newer digital records. This was next to that initial Beethoven 63 cycle that I showed you. This is another one that I got before I got really into a lot of the specifics of analog and digital and what sounds good and what doesn't. This doesn't sound good at all, and it costs 30-something, $40. Not worth the price at all. Just really no soundstage, muffled instruments, nothing really natural about it at all. So I would avoid any of the official Deutsche Gram releases if you are looking for sound quality. And I mean, even if you aren't looking for sound quality, in my opinion, it makes no sense to get these new Deutsche Grammophon issues, because you can get the original ones for so cheap and in such good condition if you just look around, instead of going on Amazon and buying one of these. And also, I mentioned it before, but this is a non-tulip label. So this was originally recorded in 1973. And so, yeah, don't go for the reissues. Just to hammer that point home, this is like a, that was Milstein with Tchaikovsky and Mendelssohn's Violin Concertos. That was a $30 record, narrow band, from 1973. This is 1977, Beethoven's 7th Symphony, also non-tulip label. Sounds way better than that one. It's from the same time period. It's an original, and it was $5. So, and it's a German pressing, so an original German. So there's absolutely no reason, in my opinion, to get the new Deutsche Grammophon digital releases when you can just find the originals. They sound better. Again, they don't sound fantastic. They don't sound super, but the bad is those digital ones don't sound good. When you are looking for records that you want in terms of Deutsche Grammophon, the best thing to look for is on the label. It will say DP right there on the label. It just means Deutsche Pressing, pressed in Deutschland. And I mean, on the back, you will see it's like printed in Germany. So these are the ones that you want to look for. Again, this one was not sealed, but you can see it's still in the shrink. It's $5. It's a good listen. I mean, if I'm going to listen to Beethoven's 7th, I know I picked these up because they have a different sound. Another good thing is Karajan is my favorite conductor. And Karajan is basically exclusively limited to Deutsche Grammophon, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's good because I can find a lot of Karajan recordings out there on Deutsche Grammophon for cheap, and they're not that hard to find. And they're in great condition usually, and I just love listening to the way that he interprets pieces, especially Beethoven and Tchaikovsky. But the bad thing is it's not, to the height of what it could have been if he had recorded with living stereo and Decca. I mean, he did some recordings outside of the Berlin Phil with Deutsche Grammophon, but most of his catalog is limited to that. I know Karl Bohm as well, who I think conducted that Brahms sealed box set that I had. He's also limited to that. So that's kind of a good and bad thing about Deutsche Grammophon. But if you're a big fan of Karajan, which I am, it's very nice to be able to find these for such a cheap price. Now, the last main point that I wanted to mention, which is kind of the biggest tip that I learned, and this is really oriented towards people that live in Canada, because I live in Canada. Generally, country of origin for records is the pressing that you want to get. So a UK band, like the Beatles, you want to get UK pressings. The Rolling Stones, sometimes bands are good in the US and in the UK. Same thing with Deutsche Grammophon. Generally, you want to get the German DP pressings. I have a French box set of Bruckner's 9 symphonies. I didn't bring it out, but it doesn't sound good. Vinyl's super thin, very staticky, noisy, not a very good sounding collection of records, and even worse than the already pretty average sounding Deutsche Grammophon records. But I was reading online, it's kind of a blog. It's not really a blog, it's just a big text page that was originally written in 1998. I'm not sure who the guy is, but it's updated recently in May of 2022, just talking about classical records. And one thing that, and I'll put the link to this webpage in the description, but one thing that this guy talked about was Canadian pressings of Deutsche Grammophon records that were pressed at a place called Côte de Liège. The address is 6000 Côte de Liège. Which Canadian pressings always have the address of where they were manufactured on the back cover. And from a source that he got, these Canadian pressings were actually pressed or mastered using all-tube gear. So similar to the way that they were doing it in the late 50s and early 60s. And so that caught my attention because I live in Canada, and I went out searching, and lo and behold, when I was just searching for DP German pressings, and I actually took a chance to look at the tens and dozens of Canadian pressings that I skipped, a lot of them were Côte de Lièges. Generally, I'd say they are pretty limited, but you can find them if you live in Canada. And by limited, I mean the amount of titles that they made. But this is an example of one. This is just like some waltzes, Strauss waltzes. This was originally recorded in 1961, but this record was issued in the 70s. As you can see, it doesn't have the tulip label. Generally, you'll see them by this Deutsche Grammophon resonance. So instead of that big yellow bar at the top that denotes it, like this one that I just showed, instead of that big yellow bar for Deutsche Grammophon, you'll instead just have this tiny little resonance symbol. This was originally released in 1961, and it says Côte de Liège on the back. And it's kind of just this address box there. They're always in this format, this all caps font in this like rectangle. So it's pretty noticeable when you're looking through records. You don't have to like look at this tiny little font. And he was right, this guy on the webpage, because they do sound great. I've picked up a few more in my time, so if you are a Canadian buyer, I would definitely pick these up. I might even say that some of them actually sound better than the original Germans that I have from the 60s. So they're a great find. It's a cool little tip if you live in Canada to pick those up. Even if you don't live in Canada, they're probably sitting around somewhere in the US. They're extremely cheap. I mean, generally 3-4 Canadian dollars, which is like 2.5-3 USD. So not expensive at all. They sound great. There's even less of a chance of them being in less than near mint condition because they're from the 70s. I said that the original 60s pressings were generally in very clean condition, but sometimes they're not. So because 60 years old, that'll do something to a record. But 50 years old, surprisingly, not as much. So generally, I just wanted to leave like an overall sound quality note out of my journey through Deutsche Grammophon, from listening to the digitals to listening to the DP pressings to listen to the French pressings. To listening to these Canadian Côte de Lièges. I have a lot of Deutsche Grammophons in my collection, and an analogy that I know helps me is trying to put it into numbers. So if we assume that decas, the early decas from the late 50s and early 60s, so the SXL 2000s, those series, the best of the best, the wideband, the cream of the crop, and the living stereos and the Decca living stereos. So I talked about those in a previous video. You can go check those out. Both Decca and the living stereos. If those are 10 out of 10, and the later Decca narrowbands and EMI and those nice UK classical labels are about an 8.5, 9 out of 10. Deutsche Grammophones are about a 7, 7.5 out of 10 in terms of pure sound quality. There are exceptions. This Strauss Emperor Waltz sounds fantastic. I would give it a 9 out of 10. But on average, when you pick up a Deutsche Grammophon record, you won't be super disappointed, but you won't be extremely surprised at the sound quality of them. It's just not to the same level of those other pressings, but the trade-off is they're extremely cheap and they're always in good condition. So you kind of have to say to yourself, if I'm not a huge fan of Beethoven's Seventh, but I just want to have it in my collection or something like that, or I don't really care too much about Strauss waltzes, then I'm just going to pick up a Deutsche Grammophon for $5. But let's say I'm a huge fan of Also Sprach Zarathustra, and I want the best sounding pressing, and I don't want to just spend $3 on Karajan's version. Okay, then I'm going to go for the Reiner version, that's the living stereo. That's the way I think about it. Deutsche Grammophon gets a really bad rap sometimes in the community, for just, especially in the audiophile community, for just not being that great sounding. That's not the way you should approach it, in my opinion. You're not going to like every classical piece, but sometimes they're interesting and fun listens, so picking them out for a few dollars is not a big budget killer. So that's my short little review on Deutsche Grammophon records. I hope you enjoyed. I would love to hear what everyone thinks about Deutsche Grammophon in the comments section. What pressings should I look out for? What pressings should other people look out for? Are there any exceptions to the Deutsche Grammophon catalog that are 10 out of 10s? And are there any ones that should be avoided? Are there any other cool tips and tricks like the Canadian Cotelier pressings out there? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts, and thank you for watching.